Okay, good morning everyone and welcome to this morning's session on the management of corn rootworm. My name is Brock Smith, a market development representative with Bear Crop Science, and I'll be your moderator for this session. Before we get started, a few things to cover off. Firstly, for those folks collecting CEUs, there'll be a QR code which will appear on the screen at the end of the session, which you should be able to scan to receive your half credit for attending this session. I will also have a draw for one attendee present during the session, and they'll be randomly selected to receive a pair of heated gloves, and the winner of the heated gloves will be announced before the end of the session. During the presentation, if you have any questions for the presenters, then please place your questions in the chat and they'll be addressed at the end of the presentation. If we happen to run out of time and do not get to all the questions covered during the session, then the remaining questions will be addressed after the session in the chat. Your presenters for the corn rootworm management session today are Lauren Benoit and Bryan Bryson. A little bio on Lauren: she works for Bear Crop Science as a market development agronomist, covering Huron, Perth, and Bruce counties. She has her bachelor's and master's of science in agriculture, both from the University of Guelph. Lauren's graduate work was in plant science, where she focused on the management of multiple herbicide-resistant water hemp in corn. And a little bit about Bryan. Bryan has the role of trait and trait launch marketing manager with Bear Crop Science. In this role, Bryan's responsible for managing traits and trait systems in canola, soybeans, and corn across Canada. Bryan first joined Bear back in 1998 as a summer student, and since then has held numerous roles within the commercial sales group, and then recently was a market development representative in the Quebec region. So with no further ado, Lauren and Bryan, the floor is all yours.
Yeah, thanks
Bob. So good morning and welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to attend today's session on corn rootworm management. Lauren and I will be taking the next 20 or 30 minutes to cover the following topics on corn rootworm. We'll start off with a brief intro to the pest, speak to its life cycle, then move on to the damage that this pest can cause to corn, and finally wrap it up with some management strategies, what tools are available for you to use in your operations. In Eastern Canada, we predominantly see the Western corn rootworm, and to a lesser extent, the Northern corn rootworm. It wasn't always this way. There was a shift, say, in the last decade or so, due to the biology of the Western corn rootworm. It's a more prolific insect than its northern cousin, since its larvae hatch earlier and feed more vigorously. It ends up outcompeting the Northern corn rootworm. Here you can see on the slide a few pictures of Western corn rootworm, some damage to roots and leaves, and these insects will overwinter and feed on the roots starting in the spring, and then emerge later on in the summer as adults, as we'll see on the next slide here. Here's we can see the insect's life cycle overlaid onto the corn growing season. So we've got the months at the top and the corn stages at the bottom. With eggs hatching in that May to June, early June, late May timeframe, or around that before stage of corn, the pest is well positioned to feed on the roots of those young corn plants. Root feeding continues through the summer until the rootworm reaches the adult stage, as we can see, in that right around that VT timing. From a scouting perspective, August is the time where you would go and install some sticky traps to assess the number of adults present. And we'll hear a little bit more about this later from Lauren. And R1, or silking, is root dig time to evaluate the damage on the current crop. Lauren?
Yeah, so corn rootworm is a pest that is most commonly associated with continuous, or at least corn-on-corn ground. So obviously, as Bryan just mentioned, they do lay their eggs in a corn crop, and then those eggs and the larvae that come out of them do feed on the corn crop from the following year. So in rotated situations, this isn't a pest that you often find. In terms of how it moves, you'll see it on the diagram here. You'll see it emerge in the cornfield. It will move around a little bit as it feeds, and then the beetles can fly between cornfields. So most of them will stay within a few kilometers of the initial site, but some of the females will move longer distances. So understanding that and understanding how a rootworm population will move between fields can influence how you decide to rotate and manage your crops. So what we're looking at here actually now is all of the little blue specks on this map this is a map from 2021, and all of those little blue specks are fields that were at least 3 years of continuous corn on corn. So you can see some hotspots in there, particularly around the Woodstock area up just east of Goderich. There isn't kind of another hotspot. These corn on corn areas, when we lay the map on top of it that looks at the density of corn rootworm adults that are collected from our sticky traps in the summer, you can see our highest corn on corn areas are also our highest rootworm population areas. So there's certainly a correlation there between the rootworm populations and the areas with the most corn on corn. Now, in terms of looking at what a corn rootworm larva will actually do to your crop, we're going to look at some of the damage assessment ratings. So this will become a little bit more prevalent later as we go over some nodal root injury score, but really what you're looking for is it's largely below ground injury to the plant. So you do look at, when you dig up your plant, you do look at the 3 most recently emerged root nodes. So on the right-hand side there, you can see a picture of a corn root that has some pretty severe rootworm feeding to it. The top 3 nodes, so the nodes highlighted in yellow and labeled 4, 5, and 6 would be the ones that you're looking at to evaluate corn rootworm damage. So the score, it's a 2 decimal point score under 3. So 0 is no feeding whatsoever, and then a 3.0 would be those top 3 nodes are totally decimated and not there. So the first number, this is the number of nodes that are fully eaten. So you can see nodes 4 and 5, sorry, are completely chewed down right to the rootstock. And then the second part of that number is the percentage of the nodes that are eaten. So with node 6 there, this is just a rough estimate kind of based on this picture, but it looks like 70% of those nodes have been chewed off within 1.5 inches of the root of the base of the stalk. So on a plant like this, pretty severe root feeding, but that's what we're looking for when we're evaluating the efficacy of these traits. A little bit of a different way to look at it in some more pictures. This is a diagram of kind of damage as it moves through different stages. So because the BT traits are bite to kill traits, even in a non-resistant situation or even low pressure, you are still going to see some root scarring just because the larvae do have to take a bite out of the root in order to ingest the BT protein. So on the really low pressure side, we have a 0.05, so roots that are essentially a perfect set of roots with minimal to no insect feeding. And then as we move through this, you can see that 0.35 all the way up to a 2.7. So in terms of where we start to see loss, it is influenced by a number of different factors, but that 0.35 is where you would start to maybe think that you're going to have some yield loss due to rootworm in a field that looks like that.
So moving on, how do we manage these pests? Traits, biotech traits are highly effective, relatively easy to use. If we think back to some of the first traits that were introduced in the late 90s for some above ground pests, with the introduction of rootworm early 2000s, it was a very effective and easy way to control the pest. It really changed the game on corn rootworm control, more consistent season-long control. We can see a very high percentage of commercial corn acres are in North America use a BT trait, and again, reduce the need for in-furrow insecticides or foliar insecticides in certain cases, and it also decreases the risk or the severity in some cases of stalk ear rots that can be amplified by insect damage to the plant because they act as vectors, bringing disease and wounding those plants, weakening them, making them more susceptible to diseases. So a comparison of some corn rootworm management strategies here. This is trials done a few years ago to look at the efficacy comparison between the BT trait and in-furrow insecticide. So in these, we see these three colored bars showing a non-BT hybrid, the same non-BT hybrid plus an in-furrow insecticide, and then the same germplasm, so the same hybrid, but with a BT trait added. So, at this time, 2003 to 2005, this probably would have been a single BT trait. So it's not, the stacks that we're used to seeing now in the market, but still shows the effectiveness of the different management strategies. So we can see here, node injury scores, as we refer to it, kind of that 0 to 3 scale. The in-furrow insecticides reducing by a significant amount the amount of feeding. And then when we look to the dark green bars, the BT trait reducing it even further, and providing a consistent control equal to better than that of the in-furrow insecticide. Not only that, but it's also a control that's specific to the pest, making it simple and safe for the user and environment.
So moving on through to the next topic, what we're going to talk a little bit about is how we manage resistance risk. So like all forms of pest control, pests can develop resistance to biotech traits. So they can develop resistance to that BT protein, and essentially the trait is ineffective. Now, a few things that the industry has done to help steward the products and to help prevent resistance, one of the big ones that is really an industry standard now is refuge in the bag hybrids. So a hybrid now has anything with the BT trait has a non-BT refuge planted right with it. So you'll notice this in your bag of corn seed. It's the seed that's colored a little bit differently. The non-BT refuge just reduces the selection pressure that's being put on the beetles. So you'll have some susceptible beetles still surviving for the next cycle. The next piece of this is planting pyramided trait hybrids. So there are hybrids available. Smart Stacks would be one of them, where there's 2 cry proteins in it. So there's cry 3BB1 and cry 3435. Both of them together have efficacy on corn rootworm. And when you're planting a pyramided trait hybrid, you're just reducing the likelihood that the larva is going to develop resistance to cry proteins as a whole. At least in Canada, we do have the ability to still rotate away from corn for 1 year. So our neighbors to the south aren't in quite the same situation as us, and you will sometimes hear stories about something called a rotation resistant biotype of corn rootworm. In Ontario and in Canada, we don't have that issue yet. You could likely attribute this to a few things, the big one being the amount of wheat in our rotation and just the amount of acres that we don't have in a strictly corn soybean 1 year on, 1 year off rotation. So a huge piece of the management strategy is rotating. And then finally, understanding the population that you're dealing with. So if you do have a resistance situation, resistance to one of the cry proteins does confer cross resistance to all of the BT traits on the market. So if you have, a Smart Stacks hybrid that is showing significant rootworm injury, rotating to a Chrome or a Duracate or an Acromax Extreme hybrid isn't going to solve your problem. That's a field that needs to be rotated out of corn to control the population completely. So rotating hybrids as a management strategy and rotating traits isn't necessarily going to prevent you from developing resistance. What is a cry protein? What is one cry protein is really all of them.
So in 2009, Smart Stacks Rig Complete corn hybrids were introduced for the control of corn rootworm. So, multiple modes of action acting on that same pest. And as we can see, there's a number of other pests controlled, and each check mark is represents a mode of action that these hybrids have for the individual pests. And also, there's also two herbicide traits with the Smart Stacks hybrids. This leads us to the next evolution in traits, Smart Stacks Pro with RNAi technology. So What are we doing? What does that mean? Is we're adding RNAi technology to smart stacks. So we're bringing another mode of action for corn rootworm control. So it will be the only product in the market, or the only trait package in the market that has 3 modes of action for corn rootworm management. And basically we'll see a little bit of data in a slide or two from Lauren, but it makes the best product on the market today from a corn rootworm standpoint better.
So yeah, so obviously this is a trait that we have been working with in small plot and in field scale trials for the past few years as we get ready for that launch and to bring this to market. So what we're actually looking at here, this is some of the small plot data that was collected in 2021, 2022 across Ontario and Quebec. So this is 5 locations, and really when we do these trials, we'll plant all of the hybrids and then conduct a root dig on them. So we are digging up a lot of plants from these trials, evaluating the root scores, and then combining that data. So we use the VT Double Pro because there is no rootworm protection on those hybrids to begin with. It's essentially our indicator. So it tells us how much pressure we're dealing with, what the population is like, and what we could expect in a totally unprotected environment. And then as we look at all of the traits that are currently on the market, so that middle 4, the Optimum Maker Extreme, Chrome, Agrosure Duracate, and Smart Stacks, we do continue to see Smart Stacks being the most efficacious traits available today. And then right immediately on the other side of Smart Stacks, you do see Smart Stacks Pro. So especially in those high pressure environments, which is the locations that we've pulled for this data set, you do see Smart Stacks and Smart Stacks Pro start to split out there, and you still see Smart Stacks being the most efficacious trait that doesn't have the RNAi component to it as well. A few pictures on the screen just to get a little bit of an idea on what those hybrids would look like, and the damage, especially notable in the middle on that VT Double Pro, and what that feeding would look like in field. Just a little bit of a different way to look at data. This is actually data that we collected from our field scale trials. So obviously we have relative yield loss and then the nodal injury score as well. So this is from our agronomist trials that the MDAs, so such as myself, would have run. We planted a VT Double Pro hybrid and a Smart Stacks Pro with the same ISO line. So the only difference really in the 2 hybrids was the trait, and that's how we got the yield loss score. And then of course, nodal root injury on the VT Double Pro to characterize pressure. So something that's worth note of here, so hybrids with root injury scores over that 0.5. So essentially of those top 3 nodes, missing half a node, they averaged 9.3 bushels of yield loss just in those environments. So that's not a type of injury where you would start to see goosenecking or any above ground injury, but you're certainly already experiencing yield loss in those environments. Now, there is some variability in this data set, and that's because this yield loss is influenced by a lot of different factors. You do have pest biotype, so if you do have a BT resistant beetle, then that is going to influence the efficacy, how effective your traits are. Pest pressure, so obviously higher pest pressure, the more risk of injury. Planting time, flowering timing, and climate all play into this. So, and then soil type as well. So corn rootworm, they do tend to like a loamy soil over kind of a coarse sand, which can be rather abrasive, but there is variability in how much yield loss you'll experience. In a dry year, you're more likely to see a little bit more feeding because the plant, not more feeding, but the plant isn't as able to recover from lack of roots that you would see elsewhere. The other side of the data set, and the one that most people are usually pretty interested in, is the yield piece to that story. So the same data that I just presented, these are the yield numbers from those trials. So the way we split this out are low pressure locations. This is where our VT Double Pro was scoring less than a 0.25. So this was very low pressure situations. We do see Smart Stacks Pro still has a little bit of an advantage there, but really we see good yield numbers in the low pressure environment. In the mid pressure environment, this is where it's a 13 bushel gain. This is where we're seeing the most benefit of having that Smart Stacks Pro trait there. And then in the high pressure environment, it's only a 6 bushel bump. So really the most interesting piece to me here, and what I gather from when I look at this data, is your most efficacy and the most bang for your buck is going to be at that mid pressure site. Those sites that are at high pressure locations, I mean, we didn't have them all tested, but there's the possibility that we do have growers dealing with that BT resistant trait, and it's just the RNAi component of SmartStax Pro doing all the heavy lifting there. And those high pressure fields really are fields that need to be rotated out of corn. So that mid pressure location is still acting as a completely efficacious management strategy. But if that population does really start to ramp up, those high pressure zones need to be rotated away. So you also do see a little bit of impact just on good rotation in the mid and low pressure when we look at those yield numbers to begin with. So these are all from field scale trials. I think we had just over 20 trials completed in Ontario and Quebec for this data set from last year. Now, pulling it all together, in terms of management strategies, there's a lot of different things you can do. So traits is the big one. We did see that graph from Brian comparing traits to insecticides, but insecticides certainly can still play a role in managing corn rootworms through traits, insecticides, and nematodes, which isn't something we touched on, but is something that is certainly starting to take hold in the industry as well. But really, if you want to truly manage corn rootworm, the best thing you can do is have a really good rotation. So you can do everything else right. Rotation is going to be the biggest piece of that puzzle and the thing we really need to focus on, both from a trait stewardship standpoint and from a corn rootworm management standpoint.
Thanks, Lauren. So, the grower is central to pulling it all together. You are the ones making the final decisions on rotations and other tools that you choose to use in your farming operations. As registrants of the trait technology, and we can see around the grower, we have a responsibility that extends beyond just customer service and customer retention, which is why we put together this diagram to kind of show these interactions. From our perspective, it's important to engage all partners to make sure that we're all bringing the best possible solution to the grower, not only from a trait stewardship standpoint, but from just a general customer experience standpoint, so that the growers can continue to enjoy the benefits of this technology has to offer.
And finally, just really our last slide here to wrap it all together. If you do have corn rootworm or are concerned about this problem, the three best things you can be doing in terms of management: scouting. So knowing your field, knowing the beetle populations you're dealing with, because that's going to influence the pressure in that field the next year, and just really understanding the level of damage that you're dealing with, which leads us into rotation. What fields are your highest pressure fields? When can we rotate them out? When are we really at risk of seeing resistance, and have we seen resistance develop? So rotation is going to easily be the best management practice. And then on the far side, pyramided trait hybrid. So just choosing the right hybrid for your field and for the population that you're working with. So SmartStax and SmartStax Pro are both really good options to use. But if there were three kind of best management practices, scouting, rotation, and proper trait selection are going to be the three there. In addition to that, you're always more than welcome to really ask anyone at Bayer or your seed dealer partner to help with advice on this as well. So with that, we can take any questions.
Awesome. So the chat's opened up there. If anybody wants to type their questions in the chat, I'm not seeing any in there yet. I guess I got a question there. So say I'm a grower with a good rotation, but I have a neighboring field that's been corn on corn for numerous years. Would you guys recommend I grow a corn hybrid that has rootworm protection to protect me from any of those bugs that can come over from my neighbor, or am I okay growing an above ground protection traded hybrid only?
That's a good question. I can take this one. So if you on any of your first year corn, you come out of wheat or soybeans the year before, you're not going to need the SmartStax trait or that below ground protection. Although if you are in a heavy pest pressure environment, that crop of corn, if it does go into second year corn again, could very well be at risk, and then we'd be recommending the below ground traits. So if you are well rotated and it is first year corn, you really shouldn't be needing that additional below ground protection. But if you are into that second year corn environment, it's really something you should be thinking of and consulting with your seed dealer and agronomist to really make
Okay. I guess another question similar to that one. How far would adult beetles move kind of within a given area?
Good question. Do you want that one, Brian, or do you want me to?
Yeah, no, you can take that one, Lauren.
Okay, so the vast majority of them won't move very far. So I think that's why I said 70% are going to stay kind of within the field, probably within the neighboring fields. There is a risk that some of them are going to move significantly. The catch with that, though, is, you know, are they going to move? That 15% that do move fairly far, they're likely not going to all move to the same field and then establish another population, assuming that that field is also rotated. So the vast majority of them going to stay kind of in the field that they emerged from or in the immediately neighboring fields. So they do move kind of within neighboring fields, but I don't think we could expect them to move, you know, tens of kilometers even.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm just actually looking at some numbers. It's about 5 to 15 meters per day, you know, that the adult beetles could move. So yes, they can move, but not very far.
Okay. Another question in the chat here. Assuming this is looking at the differences on some of the charts that you were showing there. Are hybrid differences accounted for when comparing VT to SmartStax Pro? I guess, are you looking at the same genetic base, or are there different genetic bases there?
So it depends on which data set you're referring to. With the small plot one with all of the nodal root injury scores, I don't think those were the same ISO line, but we are looking at the root scores. So there's no yield numbers that we presented with the agronomist data. So the 3 bar graphs that were blue with low, mid, and high pressures, those were the same ISO line. So really the only difference between those 2 bars is the addition of the trait.
Okay, I guess one more question. One second, it's just coming in here. I guess strategies considered to protect from resistance to the RNAi trait. You kind of covered that quickly, but you want to do a recap on that?
No, that's a really good question. Yeah, so protecting the RNAi trait from resistance, the same management strategies that you would apply to BT or really any other pest control product would apply here. So, you know, managing your population, what we really don't want to do is if you have a population that is injuring corn that is already protected with the BT trait, that's a situation you probably want to rotate away from instead of throwing the SmartStax Pro trait at an already resistant population. So managing your population, knowing if you have BT resistance and making sure you rotate away from it. And then just really, yeah, I guess the key point would just be understanding your population and making sure you're rotating away before you're developing unexpected levels of injury on those products as well. So.
Okay, that's great. So at this point in time, we're running out of time here. There are a few other questions in the chat there that will follow up after the session here. At this point in time, happy to announce that Nicole Millard has been the winner of the heated gloves. So Nicole, you can expect to hear back from someone from Bayer. They'll reach out and make sure the gloves get delivered to the correct location. On that note, this concludes this morning's session on the management of corn rootworm. If you missed anything or would like to watch a replay, recording of the session will be available on the platform at the end of the event. Thanks to all for attending.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.